Welcome to Field Botany. This will be an overview of the course and just a general introduction. Get you maybe interested in the topics we're going to cover and introduce the order that we're going to cover them in. So this is a really fun course for me to teach. I enjoy doing it when we can get outside and see plants flowering. This is a course that's going to focus on plants in Wisconsin. A lot of what's covered can be translated out into other locations. Obviously, the kinds of habitats we're going to find, the climate, the plants specifically, those are going to be best applicable to plants in Wisconsin. But if you're learning this material from anywhere else, really anywhere else in the world, a lot of it's going to translate over into wherever you're at. So I started off with an image here. This was taken by someone else, but a lovely image of Wisconsin local plant. This is a rare plant. It's taxonomically a variety, so it's not its own species, according to most people's classification. But this is called Facet's locoweed, and it's a beautiful plant, and it's in the bean family. And what's kind of special about it is it's particular to just very specific habitats. So it grows on sandy shorelines of freshwater lakes and lakes that have fluctuating water levels. So it's one that has a competitive advantage in a very narrow type of habitat. Doesn't do well outside of that habitat, and if its habitat conditions are threatened, it might not do well even where it's at right now. So as a rare plant, it's one of conservation concern in Wisconsin, and one that I've been fortunate to do a little bit of study on. So just a little bit of overview to the course. We're going to talk about some features. If you take my other classes, plant taxonomy, plant kingdom, there's going to be necessarily a little bit of overlap between those classes. So you might benefit if you've already taken plant taxonomy or if you have some plant familiarity going into this class. But I don't assume any of that. So I'm going to cover these concepts of how to describe plants, how to read descriptions of plants, and we'll all get back up to speed together if you're not currently up to speed on that. So this term morphology here, this refers to the form of a plant. So describing the shape of organs, leaves, flowers, and so on, vegetative and reproductive. So leafy parts and also flowering parts, mostly of the flowering plants in the state. Those terms and concepts will be covered. This is a big part of the course, is just being comfortable identifying plants, coming across an unknown plant species and really knowing how to approach that, how you would get to the point of identifying it well. We'll also talk about ecology. This is one of probably the biggest value added parts of this course. In my other plant classes, we don't talk too much about ecology, and certainly not with regards to specific community types or specific species. But in this class, we do cover quite a bit of that. And one of my main goals is to prepare students, if they take this class, to prepare them to become competent land surveyors. If you're studying an area and you want to know what kind of plants are growing there, being able to identify species and understand the broader significance of finding a particular species in a habitat. So ecology, as we will see, refers to species interacting on the landscape. So plants with plants or plants with animals, those all fall under ecology. Plant diversity, so having some categories in mind for how to describe plants. So the flowering plants, the non-flowering plants, the seed plants, the spore-bearing plants, and so on. We'll cover those, but mostly, as with a lot of botany courses, we're going to focus mostly on the flowering plants. They're the most abundant, the largest, the most conspicuous groups of plants, and honestly, the ones that more people find interesting would be the flowering plants. And as I mentioned, so learning how to identify plants, fitting those into habitats if you are looking to get a job in some kind of land management field, giving you the tool set to be able to approach a habitat and kind of get a comprehensive view of it. So not just identifying all the species that are there, but knowing how they can tell you about what kind of habitat you have. So those are our big objectives. We'll have different lectures that break down these various concepts individually. I also, in my plant classes, often lead in with, just a chance for people to consider, if they're not already super interested in plants, why you might be more interested in plants. So I've got my career as a botanist. It's my my domain to learn a lot about plants and to teach about plants. And I think a lot of people who start in biology, they don't always come in caring or having an interest in plants. That changes sometimes over time. I think we've got a good appreciation for plants. If for no other reason, I've mentioned a few times about looking for jobs. If you're trying to get a job and you know something about how to identify plants, if you're trying to get a land management job with a state agency or something like that, they're going to give you a lot better preferential treatment in the job interview, in the search process, if you can talk competently about plant species. So being comfortable identifying them, maybe being able to site identify some species, understanding how they fit into the big picture. It's a relatively rare skill compared with, say, the number of people who are interested in charismatic large animals or something like that. So being able to identify plants, very important skill. This image shows us some of the plants that are more prominently found in where we're at in southern Wisconsin. So we have a large agricultural footprint in southern Wisconsin. And these are our local crops. They're big crops in the United States and also particularly big here. So you should probably know these by now if you're local to this area. So the top one, corn or maize, and the bottom one is soybeans. And these are major crop products. And as we'll see, the landscape around us, right here, we're in a pretty heavy agricultural area. So driving the highways, you're much more likely to find these species really than any other species if you think about driving on major roads in this part of the state. Looking more broadly, you can look, kind of enjoy showing people these images from space. You can look down from space and appreciate where the plants are on the landscape. So these areas that are a little more green, these are areas where you would find a little denser plant populations, probably forested areas, and the areas that are more brown, that might be more grassland areas and so on. And this might change over the year as well, over the calendar year. Another one, I mentioned this rare plant a couple slides ago at the beginning. And this is an instance of a rare animal. This is a butterfly. And again, if you're not coming into this class having a great interest in plants, this might be a reason to be interested in plants. If you want to study this butterfly from a conservation perspective, butterflies and other animals need food products. So if you have particularly butterflies and other insects, they can be very specific to kinds of plants that they need to complete their life cycle. So butterflies have larval stages where they have caterpillars that eat quite a bit of plant material. And then they have adult stages where they might be feeding on nectar, maybe from other plant species. So in order for this animal to be alive and healthy and to complete its life cycle, it needs all the pieces to fall into place of its food products. So it's known that this species is highly dependent. So the species of butterfly that's shown here is called the Karner blue butterfly, as it's shown on the right there. So this is a map of its distribution. And it is highly dependent on this plant species that's also shown in the image, the wild lupin, also in the bean family there. So this distribution of the plant in the lower right is very similar to the geographic distribution of the Karner blue butterfly. So if you want to conserve a butterfly, or if you want to find this butterfly, you might want to kind of narrow your search to where the plant grows that this butterfly needs to live. And of course, this extension goes more broadly to all kinds of animals. Animals depend on plants. Just about every animal depends on plants, either directly, as these animals that are getting some food energy from flowers, animals that eat the vegetative parts of plants, all these herbivorous animals depend on plants clearly for their food, and then animals that are carnivorous, that eat other animals, they depend on the food that their food ate. So it really always comes back to plants. So whether you thought you were interested in plants or not, if you do anything that has to do with land management, resources, natural resources, or diversity, conservation, it's going to come down to the plants eventually. And as I said before, this can help you set yourself apart from other people in the job interview if you know better about plants. Here's another one. You might be looking for jobs that ask you to be able to do some kind of habitat surveying. And one of the more important functions of habitat surveying for people who are not, say, going in there from an ecology perspective. They might be interested to know what kind of soil quality they've got. And one of the major soil characteristics that people are concerned with is wetland. You want to build your roads and your houses and your office buildings and areas and be aware of what the hydrology, what the soil water levels are going to do. That can affect how sturdy your properties are, whether your basement gets flooded. And it turns out, going to here, this resource, the US Army Corps of Engineers, they have basically as one of their major considerations for knowing if an area is a wetland is to look at the plants. So you can obviously look at a place that has standing water and say, that's wet, that's probably going to have standing water in the future. But you might also have an area that rarely gets standing water, and you can look to the plants and they'll tell you that there is a little better chance of there being water in an area, or maybe there's already water underground even where you can't see it. So over here in the Corps of Engineers document on how to delineate a wetland, number 2, this major entry point here, hydrophytic vegetation indicators. So hydrophytic is a water plant, or a plant that's quite fond of growing in wet soil, vegetation, the plants. So even this Army Corps of Engineers system depends on being able to identify wetland plants or know when you've got a wetland plant. We'll do some of this during this course, kind of learn how to survey habitat and draw conclusions about what kind of plants grow there and what kind of habitat it is then. A little bit more, maybe just on a personal level, if you get to know your plants, you can know what kind of plants are out there that are interesting to consume. So these are all some wild edible plants for us, with one exception at the right here. A lot of our students who take this class might be familiar with the morels. This is a Wisconsin kind of a specialty fungus that people can find in the woods at a certain time of year. And being able to find morels, some people have their special habitats, they know where to go to find these, but you might also, if you're looking for new habitats, try to use some evidence from the plant community. And I find there's not always the most crystal clear advice about this, but some people kind of conventional wisdom says that you can find morels in forests that have a large elm presence. So it comes back to the plants here. If you maybe know the plants that your fungus needs to live, you can identify those. These other items on here are edible plant parts, so fruiting parts of plants that are some of my favorites, right? So if I come across these in the woods, I'm comfortable identifying them and knowing that they're safe to eat and snacking on them. So serviceberry, strawberry, we have wild strawberries, lots of members of the raspberry group, so raspberries and blackberries, and then mulberries. Pretty nice to be able to forage and also have the confidence that you're picking up and eating something that is safe to eat. Now, on the other side of safety is knowing a little bit more about plants to watch out for. So while you're in the field, especially in this class, one of the first things you might want to do before you venture out into the field is get yourself comfortable and familiar with the plants that could do you harm out there. So we've got plants that are just a little bit scratchy. They might have thorns or prickles on them. Those are plants to watch out for. These ones that I've got on this slide, these are a little more nefarious ones that you might not initially think to watch out for, but they can kind of hurt you on the back end. So plants in the nettle group, so stinging nettle and their this is a wood nettle here, have sharp hairs with a kind of an acidic chemical in there that's gonna, kind of feels like a little bit of a bee sting if you brush up against these plants. So being able to identify them before you get too close will maybe save you from that experience. The wild parsnip, this is one you're likely to run into if you get into, say, like a modified prairie habitat, one that's been influenced by people, or maybe, you know, close to farm fields or something. You might run into wild parsnip. This is one, if you get the juice on you, you can actually experience something called photodermatitis, where the sun, the juice of this plant makes your skin more sensitive to the sun. Can give you a pretty intense blister. I've been fortunate never to have that, but it does not sound fun. And then on the far right, this is a plant that's probably a lot more familiar to people as one to watch out for, poison ivy. So being able to identify that in all of its forms and through all of its seasons, that's a useful skill to have. So this is a form of poison ivy growing up a tree. Knowing that this is possible can help you to look not just down at your feet, but also where your hands are and the rest of your body above the ground can still get affected by poison ivy. One of our topics will be diversity. So as I mentioned, we're going to survey habitats and learn features about the habitat, being able to classify them. One of the things that you can draw as a conclusion about a habitat is how diverse it is. So give you a little second to think about this one. What does it mean to have diversity? So diversity, we use that in a lot of different contexts. Diversity for a plant community basically means having a lot of different species in the same area. So if you compare two areas and one area is more diverse than the other, one of the simplest definitions for diversity is just that the more diverse area would have more species in it. So you can, on this image, probably make out at least 5 different species, judging by the colors of their flowers, the height of the plant, all kinds of features. A little bit hard to tell from a 2-dimensional image, but we got this pink kind of flower here, these yellow flowers. These yellow flowers are different from the other yellow flowers. This one's kind of a spiky plant with these little kind of domed heads on there. This one can't quite tell what that is, but it looks different from everything else that I've pointed out. Some grasses in the foreground. And this habitat generally looks pretty diverse. So in a small amount of space, it's packed full with a lot of species. Another consideration for diversity is the number of native species versus the number of non-native species you have. So habitats that are more diverse are generally perceived to be more valuable from a conservation standpoint. And I mean, that helps out in just being able to have a lot of species in an area means that more species are preserved if you can conserve a certain habitat. There also are a lot of species, plants and animals, that they kind of rely on other species to set the stage for the habitat. So you might not find them in isolation, and you might only find them in habitats that are also busy with other plants. So plants can help each other out in ways, as we can talk about, sharing pollinators, for example, or trading nutrients or something like that, or defending from herbivores together. Plants can help each other out, and basically having a nice pristine habitat that's been unmodified by people for a long time is one of the reasons we can have high diversity in an area. So I mentioned ecology. We can work our way up the ecology food chain here. So an animal on the left here chewing on a leaf, caterpillar chewing on a leaf. And then over on the right, a bird eating a caterpillar. So working our way up the food chain. If you want to know where this bird can be found, it might have certain animals it prefers to eat or habitats that it's more adaptive to. For example, good places to hide or building materials for nests or anything like that. Birds that are maybe found more in open areas or closed areas, wet areas or dry areas. Their habitats are determined by the plants, and the plant presence is determined by other habitat features. So this term on here, community, is an ecology concept, and community is the group of species that are interacting together. So ecology, my general definition for ecology is that it's all about interactions. So plant species interacting with other plant species often gets called plant ecology. But also plant species interacting with animal species that are interacting with each other. That's kind of the broader term of community ecology. And that would just be the collection of all the species that are living in the same area and really inevitably interacting together. So whether they're eating each other, competing with each other, or just kind of sharing the same space, they're all considered as community. So if you're interested in animals, learning about plants is really the basis of that community understanding. All right, so plants, as I said, can have their own community, plant ecology, plant community ecology. You could do a lot of ecology just studying the plants. One of the things also, we talked early on about why it's great to study plants. A great reason to study plants, if you're going to learn about a habitat, is that they're easy to find. They don't go anywhere, right? So plants are going to be found in that place throughout the year. They may not always be visible throughout the year, but in general, most of these plants you're going to be able to see throughout the growing season. And you could do one of these habitat surveys using the plants. You would not necessarily have to find any animals to be able to categorize your habitat doing this. All right, back to plant-plant interactions, right? Plants, here's another one to think about on your own for a second. How does one plant species interact with another plant species? So same as other ecological interactions. It's competition. So plants compete for light is probably what people mostly think about. They can also compete for pollinators. If there's one animal and both species need to be pollinated, then they would have to both make use of that pollinator or maybe take turns or something like that. Plants can compete underground, so competing for space, soil nutrients, water, competing above ground for light, and maybe also interacting with neighbors as far as herbivores. So some plants are more attractive or better defended against herbivores. This can be helpful or hurtful to their other plant species in the neighborhood. Some plants are trading nutrients with their neighbors, competing with each other. They're possible for plants to signal to each other the presence of herbivores in the environment. So knowing about them all together is an important way to kind of understand the big picture here. So when we talk about communities, we'll have a lecture of this course talking about community types. So there are some named community types in Wisconsin and more broadly. And to know what community you have depends on some major features, such as what's shown here on this slide. So dominant species, a couple of different ways to think about dominant species. We can just think about it in a simple way of the species that are more abundant. So if you look at a habitat, say you're in this habitat, we can tell that it's shaded. So this would categorize probably as a forest habitat. And within that forest, the shade is the result of having trees growing overhead. So knowing which species are the most abundant of the tree species, that's kind of the major habitat determinant here. And then having those determinants, those dominant species, can then have a kind of a cascade effect in the other species that are able and adapted to grow around them, either next to the dominant species as other trees or maybe in the understory. This is kind of a typical habitat for this kind of condition. So we'll get into specific community types, as I mentioned, forested types with trees overhead, and then we have prairie types without trees overhead. And getting to know which habitat you've got can get you to be a little more predictive about what you're going to find there. So if you know your dominant species and your light level, you might know what kind of habitats you have. And you would know, let's say you're looking for a rare plant or a rare animal, you would know if this is the kind of habitat where that plant or animal should be found. So there's a nice resource we'll explore as we go through this course of categorizing Wisconsin habitat types and the major species that are found there, the ones that are more reliably found, and also some species that are found less abundantly or less reliably in those habitats, but still ones you might find in those areas. And if you're not in Wisconsin right now, you could also find similar, there's a lot of this same kind of information out there for other states as well. All right, so I think we covered dominant already. I think we can skip over that very briefly. So whether you've got a forest or a prairie, there are species you're more likely to run into. And just really for convenience, people use those more for defining these habitat types. So we have the species that would tell you that you have a certain habitat type. What really about the habitat would make those species grow there? So habitat determinants, what factors make a habitat into a particular kind of habitat? So think about that for a second. So obviously the trees are here on this larger image on the left. It's full of trees. The trees get there and do well. Forest species do well in an existing forest, but over time that forest would have accumulated trees, grown up to be what it is, and the conditions that allowed that to be a forest might be features of temperature, precipitation, soil type, and so on. So those are kind of the big ones. And contrasting our forest on the left here, this is kind of a moist forest with some ferns in the understory. Contrasted with on the upper right here, this is a wet habitat. This is a fen. So it's got wet soil, but full exposure, kind of a rocky substrate. You can see boulders and rocks around the ground. So probably not a very organic soil layer there, at least certainly in parts of this habitat. An abundance of water and light, and certain water conditions as well. So pH of the water can be affected in this kind of habitat. And so these are some species that are a little more characteristic of that kind of habitat. This is one called cotton sedge, Eriophorum. And similar to that, so also rocky, but not as wet in the lower right. Also looks to be a little bit more of a high altitude environment. So here we've got sunlight, soil type, altitude would affect temperature and precipitation. And all those factors come together to determine what species are able to grow here. So you can tell what kind of habitat you've got by looking at the plants, but the plants get there based on what the habitat provides for them. So zooming out a little bit more, we've got Wisconsin basically in the center of this map. What we've looked at so far with the differences of prairie and forest, those are relatively narrow sense habitat determinants. You can zoom out and get what are called ecoregions, and that's what's shown on this map. This is something that the USGS has put together along with the Environmental Protection Agency. Each area with the same color is the same habitat type, so kind of a eastern forest habitat, and this number 8 goes through a good chunk of Wisconsin and then extends out into the east. So lots of New York here and up into New England. It's kind of a steady band of similar climate and other conditions would mean that you'd find similar kinds of plants in this 8.1. So they're categorized in these hierarchical systems. So 8.1 is in the same broader 8 category as 8.2, but ends up being in a different category, different major category than 5.2 and so on. So I didn't put the names on here, but these would be classified as prairies versus forests, northern forests versus southern forests, determined between temperature and precipitation are large determinants of these. And so in Wisconsin, we've got these 3 big ecoregions to consider. Zooming in a little bit more, this is one that's got some names on it. So sorry about the different numbers, but I got a couple different sources here, all kind of going at the same, trying to get to the same end point here. So bold lines are separating out different ecoregions. Here we've got 53 is this larger ecoregion. Southeastern Wisconsin till plains, group number 53. 51 is band in the center of the state, north central hardwood forests. North of that, band 50 is northern lakes and forests. And then out to the southwest, 52, the driftless area. So what this means is on a much broader scale, you'd find typically species in these categories. You might find some species that are specific to one of those habitats. So they might be separating different kinds of forests, broadleaf forests versus evergreen forests. One of our big splits in the state, prairie versus forest. And the lines, the bold lines there are kind of boundary lines where the species are more different across those lines in general. Not to say that every species is strictly following these boundaries, but they're kind of general classification units from a management standpoint, a conservation standpoint, all the features we talked about so far. One of the big determinants in Wisconsin is called the tension zone. It wasn't terribly highlighted on the last image, but this is something that you can often see in the distributions of Wisconsin species. So we have some species that are strictly northern species, and I've highlighted a couple with ranges that really pay attention pretty well to this tension zone. So tension zone is kind of loosely defined as this northwest to southeast. It's drawn a little bit differently in these two maps. But kind of generally that pattern. So we have here the black spruce, this northern species found exclusively north of the tension zone. And then we've got this southern grass species, Muhlenbergia, that is found exclusively south of the tension zone. So this term tension zone kind of refers to groups of species that don't, if you looked at all species, this is the most consistent boundary between northern species and southern species is kind of how it breaks down. So why should that be? It's determined by a lot of factors, but one of the best predictors is if you put one of these maps down with the temperature over the course of a year. So this is what's known as an isotherm. This is basically a line of integrating data over many years. Roughly where 70 degrees falls in July. So over lots of years, they collect the data and they say north of this would be colder than 70 degrees. South of that would be warmer than 70 degrees. And that temperature, so hotness of the summer, the coldness of the winter, these are similar patterns. And so typically north of the tension zone, you find species that can do better with cooler summers, colder winters, and then species south of the tension zone, hotter summers, milder winters, and often species that don't cross over that boundary line. All right, so zooming out even farther, you can see these sort of biome level determinants. So you can maybe point out some areas of the map that are more desert habitats. We've got some desert in Western South America. Over here, we got the big Sahara Desert, the Arabian Peninsula Desert, into China. Australia's got a good chunk of desert there. And then we've got these richer green parts, rainforest areas, the Amazon Basin, West Africa, tropical areas, Southeast Asia, through Indonesia, a good bunch of tropical forest there of a similar color. So outside of our continent, you can get similar patterns in climate and therefore similar patterns in the kinds of species that would grow in an area. I just wanted to show this basically to illustrate how the habitat can be determined by these factors that are really global factors, and you get some similarity across different habitats. So if you take this course, generally, I don't think I have anybody take this course outside of the United States, but you could still pick up some valuable information from this course for any part of the world. So there's basically these climatic factors that determine species that can grow in an area, and then what species you find are also determined largely by what people have done. So certainly we live in a country, the United States, that has a lot of habitat modification. I mentioned earlier the crop plants, maize and soybeans. Those are a big part of the plants that you find in southeastern Wisconsin. And we can't really ignore those. Those are a part of the landscape. So they're contributing to food for herbivores, or flowers for pollinators, habitat for other plant species, and so on. So zooming in a little bit, those red areas are urban areas. The yellow areas on here are the more agricultural areas. And the human influence has taken habitats of a certain kind, basically the ones that are a little more conducive to having people live there, so near water bodies or suitable landscapes, and then areas with good soil and good irrigation and drainage. Those are have turned into more ideal farm areas, and that kind of has an impact on the native plant communities. So now a map of Wisconsin here showing the current land use. So a big chunk here in this agricultural color. Pink is the urban areas, Milwaukee and Madison, and then forest and grassland kind of scattered throughout the less populated parts of the state. And you can take these maps and compare the what's known as the pre-settlement vegetation. This is something that has been reconstructed using early land records. So as European descendants came through this area, they were, one of the first things that was done was to survey the area and find out what kind of plant species are growing there. So we have a pretty good record of at least kind of general patterns of what was growing in different parts of the state, and can kind of relate that to what they turned into. So the areas that became agricultural are these southern, you see there's a lot of forest on here. So this color here, forest all throughout the area north of Milwaukee. Decent amount of prairie. This yellow color is prairie, and brown color for brush. A lot of that prairie habitat also got turned into agricultural areas. So I guess if you were to consider the areas that have changed the most, that might be the areas that are most suitable for human activities. But still would have been diverse natural communities before this European settlement period. And just zooming out a little bit more, kind of the same pattern from a different source, showing estimates of pre-settlement vegetation, a lot of distribution of forests. So I don't know if that's coming through very well. It's a little bit fuzzy on my screen. Northern forests, southern forests, oak forest, and savanna is this brown color. So kind of a forested grassland kind of habitat. And then these days, non-forest, the current map shows a lot of non-forest. That would be changed considerably from what was forest originally. So knowing about what's out there involves knowing what's naturally out there, what's out there as a result of human activity. So that was our introduction to the course. That's what I've got for our introduction presentation. Hopefully got you a little bit interested in the topics. We'll pick up on everything that we covered here in more detail in further subsequent lectures.